Well, hello everyone. My name is Amy Panetta. I'm an educator, researcher, and public speaker. And I'm here today to present the American YAWP, which I'm so excited about, this open access American history textbook that's scholarly, and it's really a pleasure to go through this. We're at Chapter 3, Colliding Cultures. I want to first tell you a bit about the American YAWP. And so if you go to AmericanYAWP.com, you can go to the About section, and in the overview, it reads this way. Quote, in an increasingly digital world in which pedagogical trends are de-emphasizing rote learning and professors are increasingly turning toward active learning exercises, scholars are fleeing traditional textbooks. Yet for those who still learn for the safe tether of a synthetic text as either narrative backbone or occasional reference material, the American YAWP offers a free and online, collaboratively built, open American history textbook designed for college-level history courses, and if I'll add, published by Stanford University Press. Unchecked by profit motives or business models and free from for-profit educational organizations, the American YAWP is by scholars for scholars. All contributors, experienced college-level instructors, volunteer their expertise to help democratize the American past for 21st century classrooms. So what is a YAWP anyway? Because I don't usually hear that word at all in regular conversation. So the Merriam-Webster Dictionary online defines it as, quote, a loud, harsh, or raucous cry, squawk, or yell. It can be used as a noun for the sound itself or as a verb meaning to shout, yelp, or talk in a noisy, rough way, unquote. And you know, the word YAWP is most famously used in literature in Walt Whitman's 1855 poetry collection, Leaves of Grass, specifically in the poem Song of Myself. The famous line is, quote, I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. And the meaning of that is that Whitman used the term yawp, a loud, raw, and unrefined squawk or cry, to represent a voice of raw individualism, freedom, and connection to nature that breaks free from polite traditional society. And we can think of it, a YAWP, in many different ways in this text. So here we are at our title slide, Colliding Cultures, Native Transformation, European Rivalry, Atlantic Slavery, Jamestown, and Puritan New England. This is from the revised version 2026. So you'll hear me read this like it's an audiobook, but I might insert things once in a while where I find appropriate. So here we have on the right, this beautiful map, this beautiful atlas. This is 3.1. It's the first modern atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum by Abraham Ortelius. So this is from 1572. I love looking at old maps, so it's wonderful that this text makes use of this for sure. This is from Wikimedia. Now, as I say, I try my best to pronounce a lot of these words clearly for you and accurately. Sometimes I have to stop and repeat myself. I don't do the jump cuts like a lot of other people do. I just like to take this in one take. And so if I make a mistake, I'll go over it again. All right? So, introduction. Rival empires entered a native-controlled world. So this is important to understand here because it's not, I think I'm 44 years old at the time of recording this in 2026. When I grew up, we had this idea that the uh, the Europeans came and they just took over everything, killed everyone, and that was it. And or they came and the place was desolate, which both ideas are not accurate. We have to understand that this was all controlled, full populated areas of indigenous people that they controlled this area, and they had their own governance structures. All right, and we're going to be talking about that more a little later as well. So we're following Portuguese, French, Dutch, English, Swedish, and Danish expansion. We're talking more about that here in Chapter 3. We're keeping native nations at the center of the American continents. We're connecting competition to climate, disease, migration, and trade. So we're looking at this in a holistic way. We're not looking at it one dimensionally, but we're looking at it in terms of microbes that are brought over, uh, animals that are brought over, things, the whole, basically, the environment is changing when the Europeans came and there's first contact and more changes to the land. Okay, so here we go. Rival powers challenged Spain across the Americas. While the Spanish solidified control over Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, other European powers challenged Spanish colonial ventures in the Americas. During the 16th century, the Portuguese began to establish permanent settlements on the coasts of Brazil. The French made headways in Canada and the Caribbean. The Dutch established colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Brazil. The English captured Jamaica from the Spanish and established settlements in the Caribbean and extensively on the Atlantic seaboard of North America. By the end of the 17th century, Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, Sweden, and Denmark all established permanent settlements in the Americas. Colonial competition over the exploitation of the resources of the Americas had begun. Native peoples still controlled most of the Americas. All the while, the vast majority of people inhabiting the Americas were indigenous peoples. Native Americans lived in thousands of different polities and nations, spanning both continents from pole to pole. Outside of Spanish conquests in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, native peoples overwhelmingly controlled most of the Americas, and their power was rivaled in the interior. But in the 16th century, Native American and indigenous peoples underwent immense changes in response to climate change, the introduction of European and African diseases, mass migrations, and trade with Europeans. In many ways, by the end of the 17th century, the Americas had become a new world for peoples of African, Asian, European, and Native American descent. So, part 2, New Worlds, Native and Atlantic. We're talking about how contact transformed already changing worlds. We're tracing climate change, migration, chiefdoms, and native political reorganization. We're examining recurring epidemics rather than a single continental wave. We move beyond the Columbian exchange toward changing ideas and identities. Climate change destabilized native chiefdoms. The 17th century was a time of drastic change for Native American and indigenous peoples. So we're talking about Common Era here, or also known as AD, Anno Domini. In North America, changes began with the abandonment of large settlements like Cahokia and Chaco Canyon in the 13th and 14th centuries, at the beginning of the Little Ice Age, 14th to the 19th centuries. I don't know if a lot of people know about that there was a Little Ice Age, that there was a cooling effect in the northern hemisphere. That was just from for a few degrees annually. So it's shortening the growing season. Very interesting to think about that I don't think a lot of people might be aware of. Agricultural productivity declined in North America as the Earth's axis tilted slightly. This cooled the northern hemisphere a few degrees annually, shortening the average growing seasons and thus leading to political instability in the paramount chiefdoms of the Mississippian civilization. Mass migrations across the continent intensified as native people sought better opportunities. Some native polities moved away from large, centralized chiefdoms toward more egalitarian, decentralized communities. So we look here at this slide, native chiefdoms and pueblos persisted. Now on the right here, we can take a look at this figure 3.2. This 19th century illustration of the Lady of excuse me for a second, illustration of the Lady of Cofita tells us more about American distortions of the period than it does the reality of indigenous diplomacy. The Cofita kingdom stretched throughout much of what is now South Carolina. Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto it invaded Cofita, but eventually pushed beyond its boundaries. And the Cofita continued to rule the region for a century and a half. Quote, this is Indian princess presenting a pearl necklace to Hernando de Soto during his journeys to South Carolina, 1500 to 1542. This is engraved by John William Orr, 1858, found at the Library of Congress and provided by Wikimedia Commons. So the text goes like this. But numerous native paramount chiefdoms persisted into the 17th century. The Appalachee in Florida, Coofachee in the Carolinas, Coosa, and the Tassalusa in Alabama and Georgia, the Powhatan in Virginia, the Caddo in Texas and Louisiana, and the Casqui and Lico and Kewaltam along the Mississippi River. A chiefdom consisted of a centralized political and religious center with outlying towns of about 1,000 to 5,000 people. Paramount chiefdoms were made up of a few or dozens of those centralized chiefdoms led by a single ruler or ruling family. In the Southwest, native communities were organized into farming communities that the Spanish called pueblos that could have thousands of inhabitants, such as the Zuni, Hopi, Tiwesh, Pecos, Jemez, Toes, and Acoma communities. Epidemics struck in recurring waves. On the right side here, we have figure 3.3. This 16th century Aztec drawing shows the suffering of a typical victim of smallpox. Smallpox and other contagious diseases brought by European explorers devastated native populations in the Americas, killing approximately 90%. That's from Wikimedia. The introduction of Eastern Hemisphere diseases also had devastating effects on Native American and indigenous populations who lacked prior exposure and immunity. Estimates of death due to foreign pathogens, subsequent infections, and famine range between 30% and 90% of the populations of the Americas. Certain native populations who had sustained contact with Europeans and Africans experienced catastrophic depopulation For example, in the Caribbean, European colonialism and the enslavement of native peoples exacerbated the spread of disease. Working enslaved people to exhaustion made them more susceptible to infections, and the capture of new slaves for the replacement of deceased enslaved people further spread disease in a vicious cycle that had severe consequences. However, away from sustained contact with Europeans and Africans, epidemics had dire local effects but did not spread across the continent in one catastrophic wave of disease. Various microbes and pathogens spread locally through native and colonial networks in a series of epidemics that repeated every 7 to 10 years over 2 centuries. Instead of a single mass epidemic, native peoples from 1550 to 1750 experienced waves of new pathogens, leading over time to catastrophic population losses and fundamental social changes. Native societies adapted and reorganized. Scholars have recently begun to call these social changes among Native American and Indigenous peoples the 17th century transformation, or Native New World. Native peoples responded to climate change and epidemic diseases with social, religious, and political change. Native communities were also transformed by the introduction of European goods, particularly metal wares, firearms, and linens. New flora and fauna were also introduced, like horses, pigs, and peaches. Trade between native groups and with Europeans for access to those goods became increasingly important over the 17th century. Native people traded food, animal furs and skins, luxury items, clothing, and native captives with Europeans. Competition among native peoples over the resources for trade intensified conflict and led to diplomatic alliances during this period, leading to the formation of many of the present day native nations. Native peoples were not static. The Americas were undergoing transformational changes that predated the arrival of Europeans and Africans, yet many of these changes would only intensify over the next century as native peoples adapted to an increasingly changing world. Contact transformed all Atlantic peoples. The world changed for Europeans and Africans as well, through cultural, economic, and social collisions, including exchanges of materials, biology, DNA, and ideas. Europeans, Africans, and Indigenous Americans changed through contact with one another and with new social and physical environments. New communities were created, destroyed, and recreated in processes of transformation and exchange that altered the history of Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. The Atlantic that connects these 4 continents serves as the stage where human beings prompted these changes. For this reason, historians have begun to refer to the period of first contact between these peoples, so 14th and 15th centuries, until the 19th century as the Atlantic world. So Atlantic history goes beyond biological exchange. The movement of goods and biology, plants, animals, people, pathogens across the Atlantic has often been described as the Columbian Exchange. That term comes up quite a bit when we're researching this kind of topic. If we look to the right here, this map here is very revealing. Figure 3.4, this graphic depicts several of the most influential non-human aspects of the Columbian Exchange. Americas, Europe, from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia flowed beans, corn, cocoa, peanuts, peppers, pineapples, potatoes, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, squash, tomatoes, tobacco, turkey, and vanilla. From Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas, bananas, citrus fruits, coffee beans, disease, smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough, grains, grapes, honeybees, livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, olives, onions, peaches, and pears, sugarcane, and turnips. It's interesting to think about these exchanges. And even to this day, governments realize that the exchange of these goods can come with it some negative consequences. So here's a fun fact that if you go over the American border, like the land border basically between Canada and America, and same for Mexico to America, to the United States. Um, there are a number of different produce items that you're not allowed to bring into the country. And they're especially big on not bringing in citrus and tomatoes. And it's very interesting to think about. And some of us might kind of roll our eyes and, just kind of think it's silly. But I'm sure there's a reason behind it. And I invite you to take a look at that a little bit more closely. So, the interchange across the Atlantic had profound effects on people and environments across the globe as new industrial goods, food items, animals, textiles, plants, and diseases spread or went extinct or out of use alongside human migrations. But Atlantic history moves beyond just the exchange of goods to understand how communities reacted and adapted to those changes. Indigenous Americans, Africans, and Europeans all went through processes of creation and destruction in the Atlantic. They created new societies, transformed their politics and religions, and adapted to new problems and opportunities that arose. Atlantic history is more than the exchange of goods and living beings. It is as much about the exchange of ideas, the meaning of slavery and freedom, owning and occupying land and territory, which religion offered salvation, the roles of women in society, and many more. Survival created new peoples and cultures. For example, free and enslaved Africans were forced to create new societies in the Americas and Europe, while communities in Africa changed drastically through trade and interaction with Europeans. As discussed earlier, Native Americans adapted to a changing new world due to the introduction of new goods, slavery, disease, migration, and climate change. Europeans adapted their societies, economies, politics, and religions to new environments and through interactions with each other, Native peoples, and Africans. The connection of people from four continents transforms the Atlantic world in both creative and destructive ways. This chapter highlights some of those transformations between the 1560s and 1660s. Part 3, Challenging Spain. Rival empires depended on native power. So we're talking about and we're comparing Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Swedish colonial strategies. We're following missions, trade, slavery, middle grounds, and contested land. We're centering native diplomacy, alliance, adaptation, and resistance. Spain's southeastern expeditions failed. In the first half of the 16th century, Spanish colonists fought frequently with Florida's native peoples, as well as with other Europeans. The Spanish launched expeditions into the interior of southeastern North America in attempts to find large metropolitan native communities with precious metals similar to the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca in Peru. Native peoples opposed, avoided, misled, and cooperated with these expeditions to get Spanish soldiers to move beyond their own communities. In 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon established a colony near Sapelo Sound on the coast of Georgia that collapsed within months of Ayllon. Within months of his death due to illness. In 1539, Hernando de Soto, a veteran of Pizarro's expedition to Peru, landed an army near Tampa Bay and began to move up the Florida coast. De Soto and his men traversed the southeast for 4 years until De Soto's death in 1542. The Spanish survivors abandoned the expedition, built boats, and sailed down the Mississippi River to Mexico. De Soto's invasion depended upon ransacking native communities and taking native captives in a futile search for material wealth. The expedition came into direct conflict with dozens of native polities and led directly to the destruction of the Tuscaloosa Paramount chiefdom in central Alabama after the Battle of Mobile in 1540. De Soto's invasion disrupted native communities in the region who found their leaders could not protect their people or crops from Spanish invasions. This often led to a reordering of native political and social organizations. Native communities adapted in the face of the Spanish invasion while limiting the advance of Spanish colonialism in North America. Missions extended Spanish control in Florida. But Spain made inroads in Florida. In the 1560s, Spain expelled French Protestants called Huguenots from the area near modern-day Jacksonville in northeast Florida. In 1586, English privateer Sir Francis Drake burned the wooden settlement of St. Augustine, but Spain quickly rebuilt it. At the dawn of the 17th century, Spain's reach in Florida extended from the mouth of the St. Johns River down to the environs of St. Augustine, an area of roughly 1,000 square miles. The Spaniards attempted to duplicate methods for establishing control used previously in Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Andes. The Crown granted missionaries to the right to live among the Timucua and the Guale villagers in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and encouraged settlement through the encomienda system. These are grants of native labor. So it's interesting, these French Protestants, these Huguenots, by the way, I just find it fascinating that we have this sort of band of French Protestants that were expelled from France. You'll find pockets of them in different places. As we go through, I'm sure we'll run into them in this text. But in my own research, I come across them in New York, in the Catskills area, for instance, in Quebec, for instance. It's quite interesting. Okay. Appalachian agriculture sustained the mission road. So, figure 3.5, this early 16th century map referred to the southeastern coast of North America as Tierra de Ayllón, named after the Spanish official who charted much of the region for Spain, Diego Ribero, 1529. Maps such as these inspired later attempts to establish colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. This is from Wikipedia. In the 1630s, the mission system extended into the Appalachia district in the Florida Panhandle. The Appalachia, one of the most powerful nations in Florida at the time of contact, claimed the territory from the modern Florida-Georgia border to the Gulf of Mexico. Appalachia farmers grew an abundance of corn and other crops. Native American traders carried surplus products east along the Camino Real, the royal road that connected the western anchor of the mission system with St. Augustine. Spanish settlers drove cattle eastward toward the St. Johns River and established ranches as far west as the Appalachia. Still, Spain held Florida tenuously. And you can go to St. Augustine today and really encounter a great deal of history. Native resistance challenged Florida's missions. Native peoples challenged Spanish control in Florida, particularly over the expanding mission system. Missions were violent, exploitative endeavors that depended upon native headmen and headwomen providing labors and resources on behalf of missionaries and Spanish troops to return for Spanish gifts and support for native leaders. The Timucuan people in Central Florida began to reject the missionaries in their communities for their abusive labor demands and prohibitions of native religious and social practices. Timucuans also blamed friars for the devastating effects of disease on their communities. In 1656, Timucuans rallied together an alliance of towns and began attacking the few Spaniards and enslaved Africans in their communities. Timucuans appealed to the Appalachians for support, who rejected their overtures in favor of the Spanish. The Appalachians attacked Timucuan towns and helped the Spanish apprehend the leaders of the rebellion. The Spanish executed 11 Timucuan leaders, displaying their bodies across Timucua as a warning against further rebellion. The Timucuan rebellion made clear that Spanish power and the mission system in Florida depended upon alliances with native people. Reformation delayed Spain's European rivals. While Spain plundered the New World, unrest plagued Europe. The Reformation threw England and France, the two European powers capable of contesting Spain, into turmoil. Long and expensive conflicts drained time, resources, and lives. Millions died from religious violence in France alone. As the violence diminished in Europe, however, religious and political rivalries continued in the New World. The Black legend justified rival colonialization. So if we look here on the right, figure 3.6, other Europeans gleefully relayed Spanish atrocities to justify their own desires for conquest and plunder. This engraving by Theodore Bry shows a Spanish man feeding killed indigenous women and children to his dogs. Wikipedia. This is really a real brutal history here. The Spanish exploitation of New Spain's riches inspired European monarchs to invest in exploration and conquest. Reports of Spanish atrocities spread throughout Europe and provided a humanitarian justification for European colonialization. An English reprint of the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas bore the sensational title Popery Truly Displayed in Its Bloody Colors, or A Faithful Narrative of the Horrid and Unexampled Massacres, Butcheries, and all manners of cruelties that hell and malice could invent, committed by the Popish Spanish, unquote. An English writer explained that Native Americans, quote, were simple and plain men and lived without great labor, unquote, but in their lust for gold, the Spaniards, quote, forced the people that were not used to labor to stand all the day in the hot sun, gathering gold in the sand of the rivers. By this means, a great number of them, not used to such pains, died, and a great number of them, seeing themselves brought from so quiet a life to such misery and slavery of desperation, killed themselves. And many would not marry because they would not have their children slaves to the Spaniards, unquote. The Spanish accused their critics of fostering a black legend. The black legend drew on religious differences and political rivalries. Spain had successful conquests in France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, and left many in those nations yearning to break free from Spanish influence. English writers argued that Spanish barbarities were foiling a tremendous opportunity for the expansion of Christianity across the globe, and that a benevolent conquest of the New World by non-Spanish monarchies offered the surest salvation of the New World's pagan masses. With these religious justifications and with obvious economic motives, Spain's rivals arrived in the New World. The French. French explorers sought a northwest passage. Interesting to think about these two countries here, these two political entities. The French crown subsidized exploration in the early 16th century. Early French explorers sought a fabled Northwest Passage. There's even a beautiful song written about that. A mythical waterway passing through the North American continent to Asia. Despite the wealth of the New World, Asia's riches still beckoned to the Europeans. Canada's St. Lawrence River appeared to be such a passage, stretching deep into the continent and into the Great Lakes. French colonial possessions centered on these bodies of water, and later down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans. Cartier centered the St. Lawrence world. So on the right here, you have figure 3.7. This depicts New Orleans in 1726 when it was an 8-year-old French frontier settlement. Jean-Pierre Lassus vu des perspectives de la Nouvelle-Orléans, 1726, Centre des Archives des Outre-mer in France, Wikimedia. Okay, French expeditions to North America began in 1534 when Jacques Cartier explored Newfoundland, literally Newfound land, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence in present-day Canada. In 1535, Cartier returned and sailed up the St. Lawrence River, where he encountered Iroquoian people at the towns of Stadacona and Hochelaga, capturing the headmen of Stadacona, Donnacona, and returning to France with him, where Donnacona later died. Cartier returned back in 1541 to Stadacona and established a colony near there at Cap Rouge, Quebec. That was abandoned due to disease and starvation in 1543. The French did not attempt to establish a colony again in Canada for over 50 years. It's important that, of course, they are discovering these lands and everything, and obviously they didn't have names. You know, they weren't they didn't have names before they got there, pretty much, that they knew of. So the names eventually developed. And also, Iroquoian or Iroquois, that term is more of a French term that the French gave to the indigenous people there. As many of us know, the Haudenosaunee, they are a confederacy of 5 different nations, and they have their own names for their particular indigenous nations. So it's important to know that Iroquoian referred to, it's a name that the French gave them. But it also refers to a kind of language group, the Iroquoian versus the Algonquian. And again, Algonquian is another term that the French gave. So it's important to understand this kind of thing. Okay, the fur trade shaped French colonization. In 1603, the French returned to Canada to establish Port Royal in Acadia, that's Nova Scotia, and launched trading expeditions that stretched down the Atlantic coast as far as Cape Cod. French colonization developed through the investments from private trading companies. The needs of the fur trade set the future pattern of French colonization. Founded in 1608 under the leadership of Samuel de Champlain, Quebec provided the foothold of what would become New France, established among the Montagnais and the Algonquian communities. French fur traders placed a higher value on cooperating with indigenous people than on establishing a successful French colonial footprint. Asserting dominance in the region could have been to their own detriment, as it might have compromised their access to skilled Native American trappers who provided the furs and therefore wealth. Few Frenchmen traveled to the New World to settle there permanently, at least at that point. By the 1660s, around 3,200 French colonists lived in small communities on the St. Lawrence River. In Quebec, 1608, Trois-Rivières. In 1634, in Montreal, 1642, many persecuted French Protestants or Huguenots sought to immigrate after France criminalized Protestantism in 1685, but all non Catholics were forbidden in New France. So, trade encouraged French native cooperation. The French preference for trade over permanent settlement fostered more cooperative and mutually beneficial relationships with Native Americans than was typical among the Spanish and English. Um, and you're also going to think when the French came over to what they termed New France eventually, the climate was very different, very harsh winters. So, in order to really survive, they really needed to actually have a decent relationship with the indigenous people there. And many ended up marrying French. So, a lot of the men would marry the indigenous women. And those people who are of mixed blood are Métis or Métis. It just depends on which language you're speaking when you say that word, but we're going to get to that in just a moment. So, perhaps eager to debunk the anti-Catholic elements of the Black legend, the French worked to cultivate cooperation with Native Americans. Jesuit missionaries, for instance, adopted different conversion strategies than the Spanish Franciscans. Spanish missionaries brought natives into enclosed missions, whereas Jesuits more often lived with or alongside indigenous people. Many French fur traders married Native American women. The offspring of Native American women and French men were so common in New France that the French developed a word for these children, métis, meaning mixed, similar to Spanish mestizos. The Wendat people developed a particularly close relationship with the French, so the Wendat are our indigenous group. And many converted to Christianity and engaged in the fur trade. But close relationships with the French would come at a high cost. The Wendat were decimated by ravages of European disease, and entanglements in French and Dutch conflicts proved disastrous. Despite this, some native peoples maintained alliances with the French. This image appears a little bit distorted here, but this is okay. The title, Missions Produced Conversion and Cultural Fusion. Figure 3.8, in 1690, the Jesuit priest Claude Chauchetière, Claude Chauchetière, okay, I'll work on the pronunciation for that one soon, painted this portrait of Tecowitha, Mohawk Algonquian. Tecowitha was baptized as Catherine in 1676. She would eventually be canonized as a Catholic saint in 2012. The French sent missionaries into native communities and established missions like Kanawaki on the St. Lawrence River south of Montreal. So you can actually visit the church where she is said to have served, for instance, in Quebec. I did so last year. Missions attracted native converts like Kateri, or Catherine Tekakwitha, a woman born in Gadawega in the 1650s. To a Mohawk man and an Algonquian captive, Kateri was afflicted at a young age with smallpox and lost most of her family to the disease. She converted to Catholicism, moved to Kanawaki, and took vows of chastity. Through abstention, fasting, and flagellation, Kateri suffered for her new faith and died slowly of disease at the age of 24. She was canonized as a Catholic saint in 2012. Her story demonstrates the changing world for Native peoples in the 17th century, alongside the suffering and religious fervor that epidemic disease could bring about. The middle ground depended on indigenous power. Pressure from the powerful Haudenosaunee in the east pushed many Algonquian-speaking peoples like Kateri's mother toward French territory in the mid-17th century, and together they crafted what historians have called a middle ground, a kind of cross-cultural space that allowed for Native and European interaction, negotiation, and accommodation. This was particularly true for the region upriver from Montreal to the western Great Lakes that became known as Paydao, the upper country in New France. In the upper country, French traders created trade and kinship connections with Algonquian speakers, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Sauk, Mikwaki, Kickapoo, Illini, Miami, Mascouten, and others. Iroquoian speakers, Wendat and Patons, and Siouan speakers, Winnebago. French traders adopted, sometimes clumsily, the gift-giving and mediation strategies expected of native leaders. Natives similarly engaged in the impersonal European market and adapted, often haphazardly, to European laws. Familial and trading alliances with native communities provided the backbone of French authority in New France. Expansion strained the Great Lakes middle ground. The Great Lakes middle ground experienced tumultuous success through the late 17th and early 18th centuries until English colonial officials and American settlers swarmed the region. The pressures of European expansion strained even the closest bonds. Let's talk about the Dutch now. Dutch wealth rested on trade and tolerance. The Netherlands, a small maritime nation with great wealth, achieved considerable colonial success. In 1581, the Netherlands had officially broken away from the Habsburgs and won a reputation as the freest of the new European nations. I go into detail a little bit more about the Habsburgs in the previous chapter. Dutch women maintained separate legal identities from their husbands and could therefore hold property and inherit full estates. Dutch tolerance supported financial innovation. Ravaged by the turmoil of the Reformation, the Dutch embraced greater religious tolerance and freedom of the press than other European nations. Radical Protestants, Catholics, and Jews flocked to the Netherlands. The English pilgrims, for instance, fled first to the Netherlands before sailing to the New World years later. The Netherlands built its colonial empire through the work of experienced merchants and skilled sailors. The Dutch were the most advanced capitalists in the modern world and marshaled extensive financial resources by creating innovative financial organizations such as the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the Dutch East India Company. Although the Dutch offered liberties, they offered very little democracy. Power remained in the hands of only a few, and Dutch liberties certainly had their limits. The Dutch advanced the slave trade and brought enslaved Africans with them to the New World. Slavery was an essential part of Dutch capitalist triumphs. Hudson's failed passage opened New Netherland. So on the right here, you see figure 3.9, the logo of the Dutch East India Company established in 1602. It was one of the first joint stock companies in the world and exerted vast influence across the globe with quasi-governmental powers, including the right to negotiate treaties and create its own coins. That's from Wikipedia. Sharing the European hunger for access to Asia, in 1609 the Dutch commissioned Englishman Henry Hudson to discover the fabled Northwest Passage through North America. He failed, of course, but found the Hudson River, claiming modern-day New York for the Dutch, where later Dutch merchants returned to trade European goods for furs with local Munsee, Mohican, Lenape, and other Algonquian groups. There they established New Netherland in 1614, an essential part of the Dutch New World Empire. The Netherlands chartered the Dutch West India Company in 1621 and established colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. The island of Manhattan provided a launching pad to support its Caribbean colonies and attack Spanish trade. Dutch law acknowledged native rights imperfectly. Spiteful of Spanish and mindful of the Black legend, the Dutch were determined not to repeat Spanish atrocities. They fashioned guidelines for New Netherland that conformed to the ideas of Hugo Grotius, a legal philosopher who believed that native peoples possessed the same natural rights as Europeans. Colony leaders insisted that land be purchased. In 1626, Peter Minuit therefore bought Manhattan from the Munsee people. Despite the seemingly honorable intentions, it is likely the Dutch paid the wrong people for the land, either intentionally or unintentionally, or that the Munsee and the Dutch understood the transaction in very different terms. Transactions like these illustrated both the Dutch attempt to find a more peaceful process of colonialization and the inconsistency between European and Native American understandings of property. Wampum linked Dutch and indigenous commerce. Like the French, the Dutch sought to profit, not to conquer. Trade with native peoples became New Netherlands' central economic activity. Dutch traders carried wampum along native trade routes and exchanged it for beaver pelts. Wampum, Ogoa in Iroquoian, consisted of shell beads from the southern New England and Chesapeake coasts, fashioned by Algonquian and Iroquoian women to create a valued ceremonial and diplomatic commodity. Native women labored to string the white and purple beads together into bands or belts for specific diplomatic or ceremonial purposes, speaking the words of the agreement into the beads, imbuing wampum with communal and spiritual power. In colonial exchanges, wampum became a currency that could buy anything from a loaf of bread to a plot of land. Wampum was also used in Quebec as well, between French and indigenous there. And there should be more about that coming up. The patroon system struggled to attract settlers. So we look at the right here. Figure 310. This 1660 map, the Castellano plan, was drafted by surveyor Jacques Cortelyou and depicts the original Dutch settlement, the city of Amsterdam in New Netherland, located on the southern tip of Manhattan. In addition to developing these trading networks, the Dutch also established farms, settlements, and lumber camps. The West India Company directors implemented the patroon system to encourage colonialization. The patroon system granted large estates to wealthy landlords, who subsequently paid passage for tenant farmers to work their land. Expanding Dutch settlements correlated with deteriorating relations with local Native Americans. In the interior of the continent, the Dutch retained valuable alliances with the Iroquois to maintain Beverwyck, the modern day Albany, as a hub for the fur trade. In the places where the Dutch built permanent settlements, the ideals of a peaceful colonialization succumbed to the settlers' increasing demand for land. Armed conflicts erupted as colonial settlements encroached on native villages and hunting lands, while trade exacerbated conflict between native peoples over access to Dutch goods. Profit and peace, it seems, could not coexist. And Albany, if you know it today, is the capital of New York, and it is still quite a hub and a city in its own right. Slide 33. Enslaved Africans built New Amsterdam. Labor shortages, meanwhile, crippled Dutch colonialization. The patroon system failed to bring enough tenants, and the colony could not attract a sufficient number of indentured servants to satisfy the colony's backers. In response, the colony imported 11 enslaved people owned by the company in 1626, the same year that the Minuit purchased Manhattan. So, 1626. The Minuit purchased Manhattan. It's interesting to think about that year. And also Montreal was established as well around that same time. Enslaved laborers were tasked with building New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City, including a defensive wall along the northern edge of the colony, the site of modern-day Wall Street. They created its roads and maintained its all-important port. Fears of racial mixing led the Dutch to import enslaved women, enabling the formation of African Dutch families. The colony's first African marriage occurred in 1641, and by 1650 there were at least 500 enslaved Africans in the colony. By 1660, the New Amsterdam had the largest urban enslaved population on the continent. Dutch slavery hardened as profit displaced liberty. As was typical of the practice of African slavery in much of the early 17th century, Dutch slavery in New Amsterdam was less comprehensively exploitative than later systems of American slavery. Some enslaved Africans, for instance, successfully sued for back wages. When several enslaved people owned by the company fought for the colony against the Munsee, they petitioned for their freedom and won a kind of half freedom that allowed them to work their own land in return for paying a large tithe or tax to their enslavers. The children of these half-free laborers remained held in bondage by the West India Company, however. The Dutch, who so proudly touted their liberties, grappled with the reality of African slavery, and some New Netherlanders protested the enslavement of Christianized Africans. The economic goals of the colony slowly crowded out these cultural and religious objections, and the much boasted of liberties of the Dutch came to exist alongside increasingly brutal systems of slavery. The Haudenosaunee. Sometimes people say Haudenosaunee. I hear Haudenosaunee, so that's what I go for. Haudenosaunee formed a League of Peace. On the right here, you have Figure 311, a 1730 map of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is from the Darlington Collection. Wikipedia is where it's hosted. Beginning in the 16th century, 5 Iroquois nations that occupied territories south and east of Lake Ontario formed the Great League of Peace, better known as the Haudenosaunee, or People of the Longhouse, or the 5 Nations Iroquois. The Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk formed a new religious and political coalition centered on the spiritual message of Degenawida, who used words of condolence to remove grief from the Iroquoian leader Hiawatha. These words of condolence and diplomatic alliances between Iroquoian sachems or headmen were created to establish nonviolent means of conflict resolution within the Great League to end the cycle of mourning wars between the five nations. Mourning wars, mourning as in Mourning, mourning wars were raids to take enemies captive intended to ease the suffering of matrilineal or female descent households who had lost loved ones. By ending the cycle of violent reprisals between League members, the Haudenosaunee were able to establish themselves as the dominant power of the eastern Great Lakes until the American Revolution. Trade isolation drove Haudenosaunee warfare. But peace within the League did not mean peace outside of the League. Over the first decades of the 16th century, the Haudenosaunee found themselves cut off from access to new European settlements and the trade they provided from the French on the St. Lawrence River, the English in New England and the Chesapeake, and the Dutch in the Hudson River Valley. The Haudenosaunee sought access to whelk and quahog clamshells from the Atlantic coast that, when sewn together, made wampum, and furs for trade with Europeans from the fertile forests of the Ohio River Valley and Canada. With the establishment of Fort Orange, that's present-day Albany, by the Dutch in 1614 in the heart of the Hudson Valley, the Mohawks sought to monopolize trade with the Dutch by cutting off Mohegan and other Algonquian traders to the north and west from access to the fort. The Haudenosaunee began raiding Algonquian and other Iroquoian-speaking peoples' trade caravans to use stolen furs as trade goods with the Dutch. These raids set off a series of conflicts with neighboring peoples over the next decades, including against Mohegans in 1624, the St. Lawrence Iroquois 1630s, Wenros 1638, Wendat 1640s, the Petrons 1615, Algonquians 1650, Neutrals 1651, Eries 1657, and Susquenacas in 1660. So when I am reading about this, and in my own life experiences, I know that if you look past the borders that are now drawn for New York and Quebec and things like that, that the Haudenosaunee spanned across New York and Ontario and Quebec. And if you look at, now if you know Quebec, there's Montérégie and there's also the Eastern Townships. So, or Estrie as they call it. There's a line basically just around where Montérégie meets the Eastern Townships, where to the right of that or to the east of that line into the Eastern Townships become more the Algonquian speaking groups. So it's interesting to think about if you draw that line even down further into Vermont, and then you have New Hampshire and Maine. You have all of these different groups that are on the other side, and we hear in stories and history and documented things that they have a history of conflict between the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquian folks, the Abenaki, for instance. So the Iroquoian language group folks and the Algonquian. Now, of course, I may be oversimplifying, but it's good to understand that one. If you look, there's a really wonderful, almost like a Google map or Google Earth, but it's for indigenous cultures. So if you try to Google it, kind of search that up, you'll find a link, um, and it's really fascinating to take a look at where historically those particular indigenous groups were. So to understand it more, it's good to be able to look at a map like that. And of course, understanding and information about that is always ongoing for everyone involved. So looking at captive adoption transformed the Haudenosaunee. As the scale and pace of conflicts intensified, the Haudenosaunee looked to replace lost loved ones by incorporating captives taken from their enemies and adopting them into their matrilineal households. This drive to replace population losses fueled further conflict. Due to their expanding trade raids, and adoption of outsiders, the Haudenosaunee became exposed to epidemic diseases brought by Europeans and Africans. The first recorded instances of smallpox among the Five Nations date to 1633 and again in 1640 to 1641. The subsequent population losses due to disease fueled further mourning wars to take captives and replace lost loved ones. Through the strategy of maintaining peace within the Iroquoian League and subjecting outside nations to violence, the Haudenosaunee scattered dozens of native nations across the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, the St. Lawrence River Valley, western New England, and the northern Chesapeake. In 1675, the Haudenosaunee allied themselves with the English and attacked the alliance of Algonquian native peoples led by Metacom, ensuring the survival of the New England colonies and the defeat of Metacom in King Philip's War. The alliance formed between the English and Haudenosaunee in 1676 became known as the Covenant Chain, a series of alliances between the two nations that lasted until the 7 Years' War. By 1675, the Haudenosaunee established themselves as the major power on the Great Lakes. So we're talking about Haudenosaunee, but especially when we start to talk about Quebec and Canadian history here, that alliance between the English and the Mohawk are part of the Five Nations. That's the group that's prevalent in part of Ontario and Quebec and New York. So there's alliance there. Then there's an alliance with the fur trading and the Abenaki and things on the other side. So that's where it becomes relevant what I was trying to tell you about the Montérégie and then also the Eastern Townships. The Eastern Townships then again were more of a French and Abenaki alliance. So that sets the stage for what's to come. Now the Portuguese come into play here. The Portuguese had been leaders in Atlantic navigation as well ahead of Columbus's voyage, but the incredible wealth flowing from New Spain piqued the rivalry between the two Iberian countries and accelerated Portuguese colonialization efforts. The rivals created a crisis within the Catholic world as Spain and Portugal squared off in a battle for colonial supremacy. The Pope had earlier intervened and divided the New World with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Land east of the Tordesillas meridian, an imaginary line dividing the North Atlantic and South America, would be given to Portugal, whereas land west of the line was reserved for Spanish conquest. In return for the license to conquer, both Portugal and Spain were instructed to treat the natives with Christian compassion and to bring them under the protection of the church. Sugar and slavery powered Portuguese Brazil. Okay, figure 3.12 Portuguese map from 1574 showing the 15 hereditary captaincy colonies of Brazil. Pernambuco and São Vicente were the only two to achieve success due to their sugarcane farming. Biblioteca Nacional de Ayuda, Wikipedia. So, lucrative colonies in Africa and India initially preoccupied Portugal, but by 1530 the Portuguese turned their attention to the land that would become Brazil, driving out French traders and establishing permanent settlements at São Vicente. I said Vincente before, using a little bit of a Italian pronunciation, but here we are, Vicente. So Sao Paulo, Salvador, and Rio de Janeiro. Two industries powered early colonial Brazil: sugar and the slave trade. In fact, over the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade, more Africans were enslaved in Brazil than in any other colony in the Atlantic world. By the 18th century, gold and diamond mines were discovered in the interior of Sao Paulo and Bahia, leading to expansion westward and the further colonization of Brazil. Brazil blended African, native, and Catholic traditions. By the way, I encourage you too to look at a modern map and take a look at where Brazil is located, as well as all of the other places that we've been talking about here, just so you can put things in perspective. Jesuit missionaries brought Christianity to Brazil, but strong elements of African and native spirituality mixed with Orthodox Catholicism to create a unique religious culture. This culture resulted from the demographics of Brazilian slavery. High mortality rates on sugar plantations required a steady influx of new enslaved laborers, thus perpetuating the cultural connection between Brazil and Africa. The reliance on new imports of enslaved laborers increased the likelihood of resistance, however, and those who escaped slavery managed to create several free settlements called quilombos. I'll say that again, quilombos. Quilombos. These settlements drew from both enslaved Africans and natives. Despite frequent attacks, several endured throughout the long history of Brazilian slavery. Iberian Union widened South Atlantic warfare. From 1580 to 1640, the Portuguese crown was held by Philip II of Spain, leading to the period known as Iberian unification. Although under the same monarch, Spanish and Portuguese imperial possessions were ruled separately. Conflict between Portuguese and Spanish colonists, and especially with native communities, continued in the Rio de la Plata, particularly over Sao Paulo's colonists enslaving native Guarani people in the region. In Brazil, these conflicts intensified when Dutch invaded, looking to expand their own colonial possessions and profit from the sugar and slave trades. The Dutch attacked Salvador and were repulsed in 1624, but conquered the northeast portion of Brazil in 1630 when the Dutch West India Company established its capital at Moristad, Recife. Brazilian colonists, including many free and formerly enslaved people of African descent, like Henrique Diaz, opposed Dutch occupation and Spanish overlordship. Portugal defeated Dutch Brazil, but lost African ground. The Dutch invasion was about more than seizing the profitable sugar plantations of northeastern Brazil. They also sought to dominate the Atlantic slave trade by seizing Elmina in present-day Ghana in 1637. Once Portuguese independence from Spain was restored in 1640, the Dutch used the dissolution of the Iberian monarchy to expand in Africa by seizing Portuguese colonies in Luanda in Angola. Sao Tome and Annobon in present-day Equatorial Guinea in 1641. The Portuguese ousted the Dutch from Brazil in 1654, with peace between the two nations resolved in 1661. Colonial competition over territory and the slave trade led to almost constant levels of warfare between European powers who sought to exploit the human and non-human resources of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. New Sweden joined Delaware's contested borderland. Now, back up in North America here, just south of Albany, quite a bit more south, but you get the idea. Sweden joins the efforts to colonize North America in 1638 when the Swedish South Company settled Swedes, Finns, and Dutch colonists at Fort Christina in what is now Wilmington, Delaware. The colony was plagued by slow communication and divided loyalties between Dutch investors who wanted immediate return on their investments and Swedish colonists and investors who wanted to expand the Swedish imperial project. Indigenous Lenape and Susquehannock communities initially welcomed new Swedish traders into Delaware Bay as new sources of European goods from small European communities that did not threaten native towns. New Sweden was conquered by the Dutch in 1655, who subsequently were overtaken by the English, who renamed New Netherland Colony New York in 1664. As colonies changed territorial hands in the mid-17th century, Swedes, Dutch, Finns, Germans, and other Europeans who colonized the Delaware Valley maintained their communal identity at a local level by being loyal subjects to whichever imperial power ruled their communities. They serve as a prime example of the diversity and persistence of colonial identity through maintaining local sovereignty by pledging allegiance to new imperial regimes. So we have the Dutch in New York, we have the Swedes in Delaware, we have the French and English in Quebec. I'm simplifying, there's more to it. But here we are, part 4, English colonialization. England turned crisis and commerce toward empire. So we're linking population growth, poverty, mercantilism, and Protestant rivalry. We're following propaganda, joint stock finance, and state-sponsored privateering. We see Ireland and Roanoke shape later settler colonialization. English colonialization answered wealth and poverty. New World colonialization won support in England amid a time of rising English fortunes among the wealthy, a tense Spanish rivalry, and mounting internal social unrest. The island's population increased from fewer than 3 million in 1500 to over 5 million by the middle of the 17th century. The skyrocketing cost of land coincided with plummeting farming income. Rents and prices rose, but wages stagnated. Moreover, movements to enclose public land, sparked by the transition of English landholders from agriculture to livestock raising, evicted tenants from the land and created hordes of landless, jobless peasants who haunted the cities and the countryside. But supporters of English colonialization always touted more than economic gains and mere national self-interest. They claimed to be doing God's work. Many claim that colonialization would glorify God, England, and Protestantism by Christianizing the New World's pagan peoples. The English and other European Protestant colonizers imagined themselves superior to the Spanish, who still bore the black legend stereotype of inhumane cruelty. English colonialization supporters argued would prove that superiority. So, Hakluyt sold colonialization as a Protestant mission. In his 1584 Discourse on Western Planting, Richard Hallock amassed the supposed religious, moral, and exceptional economic benefits of colonialization. He repeated the black legend of the Spanish New World terrorism and attacked the sins of Catholic Spain. He promised that English colonialization would strike a blow against Spanish heresy and bring the Protestant religion to the New World. English interference, Hallock suggested, might provide the only salvation from Catholic rule in the New World. The New World, too, he said, offered obvious economic advantages. Expanded trade, he argued, would not only bring profit, but also provide work for England's jobless poor. A Christian enterprise, a blow against Spain, an economic stimulus, and a social safety valve all beckoned the English toward a commitment to colonialization. Joint stock companies financed overseas expansion. This noble rhetoric veiled the coarse economic motives that brought England to the New World. England's merchants lacked estates, but they had new plans to build wealth. By collaborating with new government-sponsored trading monopolies and employing financial innovations such as joint stock companies, England's merchants sought to improve on the Dutch economic system. Spain was extracting enormous material wealth from the New World. Why shouldn't England? Joint stock companies, the ancestors of modern corporations, became the initial instruments of colonialization. With government monopolies, shared profits, and managed risks, these money-making ventures could attract and manage the vast capital needed for colonialization. In 1606, James I approved the formation of the Virginia Company, named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Privateering prepared England for empire. So that richly painted piece on the right here, figure 3.13. This oil painting depicts the Battle of Gravelines in 1588 between the Spanish Armada and the English fleet when King Philip II of Spain attempted to invade England. Elizabeth I and the Spanish Armada, Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London, Wikipedia. Rather than formal colonialization, however, the most successful early English ventures in the New World were a form of state-sponsored piracy known as privateering. Queen Elizabeth sponsored sailors, or sea dogs, such as John Hawkins and Francis Drake, to plunder Spanish ships and towns in the Americas. Privateers earned a substantial profit, were both for themselves and for the English crown. England practiced piracy on a scale, one historian wrote, quote, that transforms crime into politics, unquote. Francis Drake harried Spanish ships throughout the Western Hemisphere and raided Spanish caravans as far away as the coast of Peru on the Pacific Ocean. With Protestant Catholic tensions already running high, English privateering provoked Spain. Tensions worsened after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain unleashed the fabled Armada. With 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers, Spain launched the largest invasion in history to destroy the British Navy and depose Elizabeth. The smaller and swifter English ships successfully harassed the Armada, forcing it to retreat to the Netherlands for reinforcements. But then a fluke storm, celebrated in England as the Protestant wind, annihilated the remainder of the fleet. The destruction of the Armada changed the course of world history. It not only saved England and secured English Protestantism, but it also opened the seas to English expansion and paved the way for England's colonial future. Ireland supplied a model for settler conquest. English colonialization would look very different than from Spanish or French colonialization. England had long been trying to conquer Catholic Ireland. Rather than integrating with the Irish and trying to convert them to Protestantism, England often simply seized land through violence and pushed out the former inhabitants, leaving them to move elsewhere or to die. These same tactics would later be deployed in North American invasions against native peoples. It's really important to understand how these all work together here, and how um, this tension, this impetus to take over things by the English has been there, whether it's England in the New World, or England in Ireland, or England in other places of the world. Roanoke vanished after a fragile beginning. English colonialization, however, began haltingly. Sir Humphrey Gilbert labored throughout the late 16th century to establish a colony in Newfoundland, but failed in 1587 with a predominantly male cohort of 150 English colonizers. John White reestablished an abandoned settlement on North Carolina's Roanoke Island. Supply shortages prompted White to return to England for additional support, but the Spanish Armada and the mobilization of British naval efforts stranded him in Britain for several years. When he finally returned to Roanoke, he found the colony abandoned. What befell the failed colony? White found the word Croatan carved into a tree or a post in the abandoned colony. Historians presume the colonists, short of food, may have fled for a nearby island of that name and encountered its settled native population. Others offer violence as its explanation. Regardless, the English colonists were never heard from again. While Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, no Englishman had yet established a permanent North American colony. Part 5, Jamestown. Tobacco converted catastrophe into expansion. After King James, okay, we're going to get into that for a second. So here comes Jamestown within Powhatan-controlled Tensenacomock. We trace starvation, diplomacy, warfare, tobacco, and migration. We follow the gradual codification of hereditary racial slavery. The Virginia Company planted Jamestown. After King James made peace with the Spanish in 1604, colonialization took on a new appeal. The Virginia Company, established in 1606, hoped to find gold and silver as well as other valuable trading commodities in the New World. Glass, iron, furs, pitch, tar, and anything else the country would supply. In April of 1607, Englishmen aboard 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed 40 miles up the James River, named for the English king in present-day Virginia, named for Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and settled on just such a place. But the location was a disaster. Indigenous people had ignored the peninsula for 2 reasons: terrible soil hampered agriculture, and brackish tidal water led to debilitating disease. Despite these setbacks, the English built Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in the present-day United States. The English entered Powhatan's Tensenacomock. Okay, figure 3.14. In colorum vergine piscandi ratio, the method of fishing of the inhabitants of Virginia. This is circa 1590. This image depicts Algonquian people using fire, spears, and traps to catch fish in the tidewaters of Virginia. Engraving by Theodore de Bry after John White's watercolor. The Mariners Museum, Newport News. This is in the Encyclopedia of Virginia. The English had not entered a wilderness, but had arrived in what Algonquian speakers called Sencomaca. Wahunsenakaw, the Mamanatowick, whom the English called Powhatan, led over 10,000 Algonquian-speaking people in the Chesapeake, living over 30 separate polities known collectively as the Powhatan. They burned east acreage to clear brush and create sprawling artificial park-like grasslands so they could easily hunt deer, elk, and bison. The Powhatan raised corn, beans, squash, and possibly sunflowers, rotating acreage throughout the Chesapeake. Without plows, manure, or draft animals, the Powhatan produced a remarkable number of calories cheaply and efficiently. Interesting to think about. This is the Algonquian speaking people of different cultural tribal groups, as opposed to the Iroquoian speaking people of different cultures and different cultural native groups. So we have Algonquian speaking people in the Chesapeake. Whereas before, in modern day Vermont and into Quebec, into that side of Quebec, you have Algonquian speaking native peoples as well. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a context there. Colonists were unprepared to survive. Jamestown was a profit-seeking venture backed by investors. The colonists were mostly gentlemen and proved entirely unprepared for the challenges ahead. They hoped for easy riches but found none. As John Smith later complained, they, quote, would rather starve than work, unquote. And so they did. Disease and starvation ravaged the colonists, thanks to in part to the peninsula's unhealthy location and the fact that supplies from England arrived sporadically or spoiled. Fewer than half of the original colonists survived the first 9 months. John Smith imposed labor and cultivated Powhatan ties. So, our figure 315 here. Village of Sikotan, drawn by John White. A central street links houses surrounded by fields of corn. In the lower part, dancers take part in a religious ceremony. So that's 1585, Wikimedia. John Smith, a yeoman's son and capable leader, took command of the crippled colony and promised, quote, he that will not work shall not eat, unquote. He navigated Native American diplomacy, claiming that he was captured and sentenced to death, but that Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, intervened to save his life. She would later marry another colonist, John Rolfe, and die in England. I think I've said this in the previous chapter, that at this time, we might not realize this, but Europe is also experiencing here and there some native people that come to live in Europe itself. So for many different reasons, they might have taken a boat, and there's a book out there about this phenomenon, and you can Google it. You should probably find the single title. It's come out in the last few years, and it's really quite intriguing to see how some indigenous people made it to Europe and lived there. Powhatan trade kept Jamestown alive. Powhatan kept the English alive that first winter. The Powhatan had welcomed the English and placed a high value on metal axe heads, kettles, tools, and guns, and eagerly traded furs and other abundant goods for them. With 10,000 Confederated natives and with food in abundance, indigenous people had little to fear and much to gain from the isolated outpost of sick and dying Englishmen. But as the English settlements expanded, they began to demand control over the movement of people and goods in areas of English control. This led to the First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609 to 1614, where the Powhatans attempted to preserve their control over trade and tribute in the Tidewater by cutting off food supplies to the English and besieging the newly constructed James Fort. The English successfully created relationships with other native communities outside the Powhatan control, like the Potawatomis and uh, Chickahominies, ensuring the colony's survival. By 1614, tensions eased with the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe, but the boundaries of English-controlled territories remained. The starving time reduced Jamestown to cannibalism. Despite reinforcements, the English continued to die. 400 settlers arrived in 1609, but the overwhelmed colony entered a desperate starving time in the winter of 1609 to 1610. Supplies were lost at sea. Relations with Native Americans deteriorated, and the colonists fought a kind of slow-burning guerrilla war with the Powhatan. Disaster loomed for the colony. The settlers ate everything they could, roaming the woods for nuts and berries. They boiled leather. They dug up graves to eat the corpses of their former neighbors. One man was executed for killing and eating his wife. Some years... okay, now I'm thinking, okay, they probably killed him so they can eat him. Anyway... Some years later, George Percy recalled the colonists' desperation during these years when he served as the colony's president. Quote, having fed upon our horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, rats, and mice, as to eat boots, shoes, or any other leather. And now famine, beginning to look ghastly and pale in every face that has nothing, was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seem incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of the graves and to eat them, unquote. Archaeological excavations in 2012 exhumed the bodies, or the bones, of a 14-year-old girl that exhibited signs of cannibalism. But all but 60 settlers would die by the summer of 1610. You know, it's kind of unimaginable to try to imagine that. And so it brings out our dark humor sometimes, right? Jamestown remained a commercial catastrophe. Little improved over the next several years. By 1616, 80% of all English immigrants who had arrived in Jamestown had perished. England's first American colony was a catastrophe. The colony was reorganized, though the colony still limped along as a starving, commercially disastrous tragedy. The colonists were unable to find any profitable commodities and remained dependent on Native Americans and sporadic shipments from England for food. But then, tobacco saved Jamestown. Tobacco rescued Virginia's economy. By the time King James I described tobacco as a, quote, noxious weed, loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs, unquote, it had already taken Europe by storm. In 1616, John Rolfe crossed tobacco strains from Trinidad and Guyana, and planted Virginia's first tobacco crop. In 1617, the colony sent its first cargo of tobacco back to England. The noxious weed, a native of the New World, fetched a high price in Europe, and the tobacco boom began in Virginia and then later spread to Maryland. Within 15 years, American colonists were exporting over 500,000 pounds of tobacco per year. Within 40 years, they were exporting 15 million. So tobacco changed everything. Tobacco drove migration and the headright system. So on the right, we have figure 3:16, a map of Virginia, with a description of the country, the commodities, people, government, and religion, discovered and described by Captain John Smith, 1612, engraving by William Hull. That's in Wikipedia. So tobacco, it saved Virginia from ruin, incentivized further colonization, and laid the groundwork for what would become the United States. With a new market open, Virginia drew not only merchants and traders, but also settlers. Colonists came in droves. They were mostly young, mostly male, and mostly indentured servants who signed contracts called indentures that bonded them to employers for a period of years in return for passage across the ocean. But even the rough terms of servitude were no match for the promise of land and potential profits that beckoned English farmers. Despite these lures, there were not enough colonists. Tobacco was a labor intensive crop, and ambitious planters with seemingly limitless land before them lacked only laborers to escalate their wealth and status. The colony's great labor vacuum inspired the creation of the head rate policy in 1618. Any person who migrated to Virginia would automatically receive 50 acres of land, and any immigrant whose passage they paid would entitle them to 50 acres more. Pretty incredible to think about. Government arrived alongside African bondage. In 1619, the Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, a limited representative body composed of white landowners that first met in Jamestown. That same year, a Dutch slave ship sold 20 Africans to the Virginia colonists. Southern slavery was born. Expansion made war with the Powhatan inevitable. Soon the tobacco-growing colonists expanded beyond the bounds of Jamestown's deadly peninsula. When it became clear that the English were not merely intent on maintaining a small trading post but sought a permanent, ever-expanding colony, conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy became almost inevitable. Powhatan died in 1622 and was succeeded by his brother, Opechancanough, who promised to drive the land-hungry colonists back into the sea. He launched a surprise attack, and in a single day, March 22nd, 1622, killed over 350 colonists, or one-third of all colonists in Virginia, marking the beginning of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, 1622 to 1632. The colonists retaliated and perpetuated massacres on indigenous settlements many times over. The surprise attack freed the colonists to drive Native Americans off their land. The governor of Virginia declared it colonial policy to achieve the, quote, expulsion of the savages to gain the free range of the country, unquote. War and disease tilted the balance of power decisively toward the English colonizers as they drove Powhatan communities inland to the fall line on the James River. So, what is striking to me that I have reflected on this in the previous chapter, that as I was growing up, sometimes there's this false assumption that when Columbus came and he was the only one, and that's false. We know that. He came and slaughtered every native person, and none of them exist anymore. That's not true at all. And the descendants of those indigenous people are still with us today. They're living. Some are thriving. But we also have, this. Lost my train of thought. 1 second here. So we have to understand that in one fell swoop, the native population didn't just leave or were decimated, but changes happened gradually over time with different battles, war and disease, things of that nature. It didn't happen all at one time. It happened gradually. And war and disease happened, but then also certain policies came into place that really impacted native populations. So it's more nuanced than what we think. Okay. Chesapeake trade redrew indigenous alliances. In the midst of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, English colonist William Claiborne, sorry, Claiborne established a trading post in 1629 on present-day Kent Island, Maryland, trading European goods and firearms to Susquehannock communities living along the northern Chesapeake and Delaware bays. The Susquehannocks had recently migrated southward from the Susquehanna Valley due to pressure from the Haudenosaunee and the potential for trade with coastal Algonquian people and Europeans. After initial conflicts, the Susquehannocks established kinship connections with the Lenape peoples of Delaware Bay, who are frequently trading with the Dutch in New Netherlands and the Swedes in New Sweden. And that also includes New Jersey as well, but we'll get to New Jersey in a while. But in 1638, English agents of the recently established colony of Maryland in 1632 declared Claiborne a pirate and seized his trading post, demanding that the Susquehannocks trade with Maryland instead. The Susquehannocks refused. Maryland colonists quickly established trading relationships with the Piscataways, and there's a Piscataway, New Jersey, by the way, enemies of the Susquehannocks, which fueled conflict between the two indigenous nations until the Susquehannocks signed a peace treaty with Maryland in 1652. For Maryland, like Virginia, competition over trade with native peoples and expanding settlements exacerbated conflict between native nations and with English colonists. Women were recruited to stabilize settlement. To sustain expansion in Virginia, the Virginia Company invested in the importation of English indentured servants, and particularly unmarried women. Colonial administrators worried about unmarried men refusing to settle on lands without marriage prospects. Therefore, the Virginia Company encouraged the importation of 147 women between 1620 and 1622, placing a per-head price of 120 pounds of tobacco on the purchase of these women for marriage. While more women arrived, the plan was a failure, as the disparity of unmarried men to women only increased over the 17th century. This unbalanced sex ratio led to violent competition over women, premarital sex, cohabitation between male and female servants, and interracial sex and marriage. English supremacy hardened into racial ideology. As the territory and population of Virginia colony expanded, English colonists brought to the New World particular visions of racial, cultural, and religious supremacy. Despite starving in the shadow of the Powhatan Confederacy, English colonists nevertheless judged themselves physically, spiritually, and technologically superior to native peoples in North America. Christianity, metallurgy, intensive agriculture, transatlantic navigation, and even wheat farming all magnified English self-regard. This sense of superiority, when coupled with outbreaks of violence, left the English feeling entitled to indigenous lands and resources. Atlantic slavery preceded Jamestown. Spanish conquerors established the framework for the Atlantic slave trade over a century before the first chained Africans arrived at Jamestown. Even Bartolome de las Casas celebrated his pleas to save Native Americans from colonial butchery. For a time recommended that indigenous labor be replaced by importing Africans. Early English settlers from the Caribbean and Atlantic coast of North America mostly imitated European ideas of African inferiority. Race followed the expansion of slavery across the Atlantic world. Skin color and race suddenly seemed fixed. Englishmen equated Africans with categorical blackness and blackness with sin, quote, the handmaid and symbol of baseness, unquote. An English essayist in 1695 wrote that, quote, a Negro will always be a Negro. Carry him to Greenland, feed him chalk, feed and manage him never so many ways, unquote. More and more Europeans embraced the notion that Europeans and Africans were distinct races. Others now preach that the Old Testament God cursed Ham, the son of Noah, and doomed black people to perpetual enslavement. Early Virginia slavery was not yet fully codified. And yet, in the early years of American slavery, ideas about race were not yet fixed, and the practice of slavery was not yet codified. The first generations of Africans in English North America faced miserable conditions, but in contrast to later American history, their initial servitude was not necessarily permanent, heritable, or even particularly disgraceful. Africans were definitively set apart as fundamentally different from their white counterparts and faced longer terms of service and harsher punishments. But, like the indentured white servants whisked away from English slums, some of the first Africans in North America also worked for only a set number of years before becoming free landowners themselves. The Angolan Anthony Johnson, for instance, was sold into servitude but fulfilled his indenture and became a prosperous tobacco planter and enslaver himself. Compulsory labor in Virginia was hard labor, particularly on tobacco plantations. The shared work, often side by side, between white servants and enslaved black and native people of both sexes created what one scholar has called a, quote, peculiar brand of equality, unquote. But this egalitarianism was based on harsh treatment of laborers and would increasingly become racialized over time. Slavery in 17th century America had yet to be legally tied to blackness. Tobacco and conquest transformed Virginia. In 1622, at the dawn of the tobacco boom, Jamestown still seemed a failure. By the end of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War in 1632, the rise of tobacco and the displacement of the Powhatan turned the tide. Colonists escaped the deadly peninsula, and immigrants poured into the colony to grow tobacco and turn a profit for the crown. But in 1644, Opechancanough launched another devastating attack on the Virginia colony, killing over 400 colonists, starting the Third Anglo-Powhatan War. Like in 1622, the Powhatans sought to reassert their own boundaries in the face of expanding English settlement on their territories. The English responded by invading Powhatan lands and sacking and burning towns, cornfields, and religious structures. In 1646, Opechancanough was captured during peace talks and taken prisoner. He was murdered in Jamestown later that year by an English colonist. The peace treaty of 1646, negotiated with Opechancanoug's successor, Nicotowans, declared the Powhatans and their Pamunkey, there you go, Pamunkey allies, tributaries of the Virginia colony and subjects of the crown, in return for the protection of their lands. The English used the sale of captive natives and lands to pay for the conflict. The English colony restricted the mobility of native peoples and confined the Pamunkey to a locale that they still inhabit today. The Third Anglo-Powhatan War marked the destruction of the Powhatan as a paramount chiefdom and scattered native communities into the interior or allocated them to small towns as tributary subjects of the crown. Virginia made racial slavery hereditary. As the Virginia colony expanded and defined its boundaries and power over native peoples, the reliance on the enslavement of native and African laborers increased. By the end of the 17th century, enslaved Africans largely replaced indentured servants as the main source of colonial labor. In 1662, the Virginia Assembly tied enslaved status for children to the status of the mother, enslaving the children of enslaved women, and imposed stricter fines for interracial sex. Conflict with native peoples continued as planters and former indentured servants sought new lands and indigenous captives, culminating in the Susquehannock War of 1676. As the 17th century progressed, Virginia's success as a colony increasingly depended on the importation of enslaved Africans, a trend that only amplified in the 18th century. Part 6, New England. Puritan communities joined faith, family, and conquest. Here we're going to follow Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay within Wampanoag homelands. We're connecting family migration, town government, religion, and prosperity. We're going to examine the Pequot War and the limits of Puritan social uniformity. Wampanoag aid sustained Plymouth. English colonists arrived in New England to establish the Plymouth colony in 1620 in what local Abenaki speakers called Wampanoag, Dawnland, or Ndinka, our land. So these are all indigenous people here. Colonists were stunned to initially be greeted by indigenous men who spoke English. Samoset of the Wabanaki and Squanto of Patuxet warmly welcomed the colonists by bartering goods. So it's interesting, as I was mentioning before, just this sort of influence of having had traded with Europeans in the past before English colonists had arrived to that area, for instance. But it even happened even further back than that. Samoset and Squanto had experience trading with English vessels in the region, and Squanto, like other indigenous men and women, had previously endured English captivity before being returned by English seamen. By 1621, the Plymouth colony established a treaty of friendship and alliance with the Wampanoag people under the leader Usamiquin, who was known by his title of the Great Sachem, Massasoit. This treaty of reciprocity with the Wampanoags allowed the English to establish settlements in a peaceful environment, ironically encouraging further colonization. New England colonization claimed religious purpose. The English colonies in New England, established from 1620 onward, were founded with loftier goals than those in Virginia. Although migrants to New England expected economic profit, religious motives directed the rhetoric and much of the reality of these colonies. Not every English person who moved to New England during the 17th century was a Puritan, but Puritans dominated the politics, religion, and culture of New England. Even after 1700, the region's Puritan inheritance shaped many aspects of its history. I believe, and we might get to it later, that Puritans, in order to vote in certain towns set up, certain land holdings, that you had to be a member of the Puritan church. So interesting to think about and research further. Puritans sought to purify English Christianity. The term Puritan began as an insult, and its recipients usually referred to each other as the godly, if they used a specific term at all. Puritans believed that the Church of England had not distanced itself far enough from Catholicism since Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s. Basically, I'm going to add, because he couldn't get divorced, so he decided to go Protestant. They largely agreed with European Calvinist followers of the theologian John Calvin on matters of religious doctrine. Calvinists and Puritans believed that humankind was redeemed by God's grace alone, and that the fate of an individual's immortal soul was predestined. The happy minority that God had already chosen to save were known among the English Puritans as the elect. Calvinists also argued that the decoration of churches, reliance on ornate ceremony, and corrupt priesthood obscured God's message. They believed that reading the Bible was the best way to understand God. Puritan life allowed pleasure within moral limits. So we're looking at figure 317, Seal of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the History Project, UC Davis. So we're looking at the seal. Puritans were stereotyped by their enemies as dour killjoys, and the exaggeration has endured. It is certainly true that the Puritans' disdain for excess and opposition to many holidays popular in Europe, including Christmas, which as Puritans never tired of reminding everyone, the Bible never told anyone to celebrate, lent themselves to caricature, but Puritans understood themselves as advocating a reasonable middle path in a corrupt world. It would never occur to a Puritan, for example, to abstain from alcohol or sex. Interestingly enough. Persecution pushed Puritans toward New England. During the first century after the English Reformation, circa 1530 to 1630, Puritans sought to purify the Church of England of all practices that smacked of Catholicism, advocating a simpler worship service, the abolition of ornate churches, and other reforms. They had some success in pushing the Church of England in a more Calvinist direction, but with the coronation of King Charles I, 1625 to 1649, the Puritans gained an implacable foe that cast English Puritans as excessive and dangerous. Facing growing persecution, the Puritans began the Great Migration, during which about 20,000 people traveled to New England between 1630 and 1640. The Puritans, unlike the small band of separatist pilgrims who founded Plymouth Colony in 1620, remained committed to reforming the Church of England, but temporarily decamped to North America to accomplish this task. Leaders like John Winthrop insisted that they were not separating from or abandoning England, but were rather forming a godly community in America that would be a city on a hill and an example for reformers back home. The Puritans did not seek to create a haven of religious toleration, a notion that they, along with nearly all European Christians, regarded as ridiculous at best and dangerous at worst. So that is interesting. So Puritans and Pilgrims were different, and the Pilgrims came first. They share some similarities, but there are some differences. The Pilgrims wanted to completely break from the Church of England, and Puritans were a bit different. I was going to just comment a little bit about the fact that Puritans didn't seek to create a haven of religious toleration. Although Calvinists or the descendants of Calvinists, they did work toward some version of religious toleration, but it was really like religious toleration and religious freedom for their own particular denomination. So there's some problems with that. But it made way, and it allowed different denominations to arise and to actually embrace what we would think of as religious toleration today, such as Unitarians or Unitarian Universalism or Universalists and such like that. 76. Families and communities distinguished New England. While the Puritans did not succeed in building a godly utopia in New England, a combination of Puritan traits with several external factors created colonies widely different from any other region settled by English people. Unlike those heading to Virginia, colonists in New England, Plymouth 1620, Massachusetts Bay 1630, Connecticut 1636 and Rhode Island 1636 generally arrived in family groups. Most New England immigrants were small landholders in England, a class that the contemporary English called the middling sort. When they arrived in New England, they tended to replicate their home environments, founding towns composed of independent landholders. The New England climate and soil made large-scale plantation agriculture impractical, so the system of large landholders using masses of enslaved laborers or indentured servants to grow labor-intensive crops largely failed, thankfully. But small numbers of enslaved Africans did arrive in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638 aboard the Salem-based vessel Desire. Evidence exists of an enslaved woman being sexually assaulted by another enslaved man at the order of their Anglican enslaver, Samuel Maverick, in 1638. So Anglican is the Church of England. By the 17th century, over 1,000 enslaved and free Africans lived in New England. Other Puritans made their fortunes as enslavers on Caribbean sugar islands, and New England merchants profited as suppliers of provisions and enslaved laborers to those colonies. So it's an interesting thing to consider. I have an ancestor. His name is William Nickerson, and he started the town of Chatham on Cape Cod. He bought the land supposedly from the Wampanoag, I believe it was the Wampanoag, and gave them all a whole list of different trinkets and goods, things like that, for that land. Interesting to think about. Then his children then formed relationships with Native people, and they had families. They didn't all form families with Native people, but a lot of them did. And that history is very interesting. There's the Nickerson State Park that's on Cape Cod, which is interesting to think about, and also a lot of historical things that you can visit in relation to the Nickerson family and how they got there. So, just a little backstory there. 77, mixed farming produced modest prosperity. Although New England colonies could boast wealthy landholding elites, the disparity of wealth in the region remained narrow compared to the Chesapeake, Carolina, or the Caribbean. Instead, 17th century New England was characterized by a broadly shared, modest prosperity based on a mixed economy dependent on small farms, shops, fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, and trade with native peoples and the Atlantic world. Health and stability aided settler expansion. A combination of environmental factors and the Puritan social ethos produced a region of remarkable health and stability during the 17th century. New England immigrants avoided most of the deadly outbreaks of tropical disease that turned the Chesapeake colonies into graveyards. Disease, in fact, only aided English settlement and relations to Native Americans. In contrast to other English colonists who had to contend with powerful Native American neighbors, the Puritans confronted the stunned survivors of a biological catastrophe. A lethal pandemic of smallpox during the 1610s and subsequent epidemics killed as much as 90% of the region's Native American population over the next 200 years. Many survivors welcomed the English as potential allies against rival nations who had escaped the catastrophe. The relatively healthy environment, coupled with political stability and the predominance of family groups among the early immigrants, allowed the New England population to grow to 91,000 people by 1700 and from only 21,000 immigrants. In contrast, 120,000 English went to the Chesapeake and only 85,000 white colonists remained in 1700. The Puritan towns joined land, worship, and discipline. The New England Puritans set out to build their utopia by creating communities of the godly. Groups of men, often from the same region of England, applied to the colony's general court for land grants. They generally divided part of the land for immediate use while keeping much of the rest as commons or undivided land for future generations. The town's inhabitants collectively decided the size of each settler's home lot based on their current wealth and status. Besides oversight of property, the town restricted membership, and new arrivals needed to apply for admission. Those who gained admittance could participate in town governments that, while not democratic by modern standards, nevertheless had broadly popular involvement. All male property holders could vote in town meetings and choose selectmen, assessors, constables, and other officials from among themselves to conduct the daily affairs of government. Upon their founding, towns wrote covenants reflecting the Puritan belief in God's covenant with his people. Towns sought to arbitrate disputes and contain strife, as did the church. Wayward or divergent individuals were persuaded, corrected, or coerced. Popular conceptions of Puritans as hardened authoritarians are exaggerated, but if persuasion and arbitration failed, people who did not conform to community norms were punished or removed. Massachusetts banished Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, and other religious dissenters like the Quakers. So they seem to want a bit of a monoculture or certain ideological background of the inhabitants there. Wampum trade tensions sparked Pequot conflict. New England colonist relationships with native peoples deteriorated within the first generation of settlement. In the 1630s, Pequot communities in present-day Connecticut began to have conflict with the Dutch, English, and Narragansetts over trade in the prized clam shells from the coasts used to make wampum. Pequots regularly exacted tribute payments from neighboring Narragansetts and Montauk communities. When the Pequots killed 2 English traders, Narragansetts and Mohegans decided to create an alliance with the English and attacked the Pequots. English forces massacred the Pequot at Mystic. In May 1637, an armed contingent of English Puritans from Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Connecticut colonies trekked into Pequot territory that was claimed by New England. Referring to themselves as the Sword of the Lord, this military force intended to attack, quote, that insolent and barbarous nation called the Pequots, unquote. In the resulting violence, Puritans put the Mystic community to the torch, beginning with the north and south ends of the town. As Pequot men, women, and children tried to escape the blaze, the soldiers waited with swords and guns. One commander estimated that the, quote, 400 souls in this fort, not above 5 of them, escaped out of our hands, unquote. Although another counted near, quote, 600 or 700, unquote, dead. In a span of less than 2 months, the English Puritans boasted that the Pequot, quote, were drove out of their country and slain by the sword to the number of 1,500, unquote. Those Pequots who did not flee were enslaved and either distributed among New England households or sold to the Caribbean. The Pequot War secured English expansion. And we see on the right, Figure 318, this engraving depicts the Mystic Massacre, where Connecticut settlers, along with the Narragansett and the Mohegan allies, set fire to a Pequot settlement and then slaughtered those who tried to escape. from John Underhill, News from America, London, 1638, Wikipedia. The Pequot War began out of competition over access to natural resources and disputes over tribute payments between native communities. Once the English committed, the conflict had devastating outcomes for the Pequots. The devastation of the Pequots provided safety and stability for the fledgling New England colonies to expand settlements further. Narragansetts and Mohegans also benefited for a time from the victory over the Pequots, but would join the Wampanoags in their conflict with the English in King Philip's War in 1675. Puritan utopia disappointed its founders. Although by many measures colonization in New England succeeded, its Puritan leaders failed in their own mission to create a utopian community that would inspire their fellows back in England. They tended to focus their disappointment on the younger generation. Quote, "But alas," unquote, Increase Mather lamented, quote, "that so many of the younger generation have so early corrupted the founders' doings," unquote. The Jeremiad, a sermon lamenting the fallen state of New England due to its straying from its early virtuous path, became a staple of late 17th century Puritan literature. Prosperity weakened Puritan uniformity. Yet the Jeremiad could not stop the effects of prosperity. The population spread and grew more diverse. Many, if not most, New Englanders retained strong ties to their Calvinist roots into the 18th century, but the Puritans, who became Congregationalists, and I believe that's what happened with my particular ancestors on that one lineage, struggled against a rising tide of religious pluralism. On December 25th, 1727, Judge Samuel Sewall noted in his diary that a new Anglican minister, quote, "keeps the day in his new church at Braintree. People flock thither," unquote. Previously, forbidden holidays like Christmas were celebrated publicly in church and privately in homes. Puritan minister Cotton Mather discovered on Christmas 1711 that, quote, "a number of young people of both sexes belonging, many of them, to my flock had a frolic, a reveling feast, and a ball which discovers their corruption," unquote. Despite the lamentations of the Mathers and other Puritan leaders of their failure, they left an enduring mark on New England culture and society that endured long after the region's residents ceased to be called Puritan. Interestingly enough, when they're talking about revels, there's something called the midwinter revels, and it's in different areas, and different groups, different community groups will come and they will have sort of this midwinter festival, kind of a Christmas show, but also drawing in folklore and some earth-based traditions, and they will present it to the community. There's one that's often presented in sort of the Dartmouth, New Hampshire area there, and it's fantastic to see. But it's interesting to see because the Puritans had sort of protested this revels, the reveling. And we come to the conclusion already. Finally, 7, conclusion. Small colonies secured a lasting English foothold. We're comparing mainland colonies with richer Caribbean sugar societies. We're connecting tobacco and sugar to enslaved African and native labor. We're recognizing how collision produced exploitation and new identities. Small colonies created a durable English foothold. The fledgling settlements in Virginia and Massachusetts paled in importance when compared to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean. Valued more as marginal investments and social safety valves where the poor could be released, these colonies nonetheless created a foothold for Britain on a vast North American continent. And although the 17th century would be fraught for Britain, religious, social, and political upheavals would behead one king and force another to flee his throne. Settlers in Massachusetts and Virginia were nonetheless tied together by the emerging Atlantic economy, while commodities such as tobacco and sugar fueled new markets in Europe. The economy grew increasingly dependent on enslaved labor. Enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic would further complicate the collision of cultures in the Americas. The native slave trade expanded, spurring on cycles of violence, migration, and disease as native communities adapted to the arrival of Europeans and Africans. The creation and maintenance of a slave system would spark new understandings of human difference and new modes of social control. The economic exchanges of the new Atlantic economy would not only generate great wealth and exploitation, but would also lead to new cultural systems and new identities for the inhabitants of at least 4 continents. So, just a little bit of attribution and reuse. This adaptation remains open. The source is, of course, the American YAWP, Chapter 3, Colliding Cultures. This is the revised chapter version used for this 2026 video lecture. And it's licensed by Creative Commons. And if you ever want to go to the website for more references, more information, AmericanYAWP.com is where you would like to go. And without further ado, I would like to close this out today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to Chapter 4.